What is leadership? Is it a commander shouting in front of a crowd, or a genius in the shadows crafting the strategy? Today's story takes us to medieval England, a time when a king's reputation was more valuable than his crown. We'll see how one advisor gained power without using it, how he ruled a kingdom, and how no one even noticed. This isn't just a story of victory. It's also a story about the most important secret of power, a secret that still holds true in today's corporate hierarchies and political campaigns. In the mist-covered valleys of medieval England, where stone castles pierced the sky like prayers to an indifferent god, there existed a truth more valuable than all the gold in the royal treasury. In a world where kings rise and fall on the strength of their reputation, the one who controls the story controls the crown itself. For when nobles and knights, merchants and peasants all look to their ruler for strength and wisdom, the architect of that image becomes the architect of power. The year was 1347, and King Edward III had ruled England for 20 years. Yet he had never faced a crisis quite like this one. The Scottish rebellion had erupted along the northern borders, led by a cunning warlord named Robert the Bold, whose tactical brilliance had already claimed 3 English strongholds in as many weeks. The royal court buzzed with whispered fears and poorly concealed panic as reports arrived daily of burning villages and advancing enemy forces. Within the great hall of Windsor Castle, where tapestries depicted the glorious victories of Edward's ancestors, and every stone seemed to echo with the weight of royal authority, a young court advisor named William de Montfort faced the challenge that would define not only his career, but the very nature of power itself. At 32, William possessed the kind of strategic mind that could see 3 moves ahead in any political game. But he also understood something that many brilliant men failed to grasp. In the world of medieval politics, being right was far less important than appearing loyal. King Edward was a man of considerable personal courage and undeniable charisma, qualities that had served him well in the ceremonial aspects of kingship. He could inspire troops with a rousing speech, command respect in foreign courts, and project the kind of regal authority that made common people bow their heads in reverence. But when it came to the complex art of military strategy, Edward's instincts consistently led him toward solutions that were bold, dramatic, and almost certainly disastrous. The crisis reached its peak on a cold October morning when scouts brought word that Robert the Bold's army was marching toward the strategic town of Berwick, whose capture would give the Scots control of the entire northern trade route. The King's War Council gathered in the castle's map room, where a massive table displayed detailed drawings of the borderlands and colored tokens representing various military forces. Edward stood at the head of the table, his royal bearing impressive even in the face of crisis, and announced his solution with characteristic confidence. "We will meet them head-on at Berwick," he declared, moving tokens across the map with decisive gestures. "A direct assault with our full force. Let Robert the Bold see the true strength of English steel." The assembled nobles murmured their agreement, but William noticed the subtle tension in their voices, the way their eyes avoided direct contact when they voiced their support. They all understood what Edward seemed unable to grasp. Robert the Bold had chosen Berwick precisely because it was perfect terrain for a trap. The narrow approaches to the town would negate England's numerical advantage, while the surrounding hills provided countless opportunities for ambush. But pointing this out directly would be more than futile. It would be career suicide. Edward had built his entire identity around his role as a warrior king, and any suggestion that his military instincts were flawed would be perceived not as helpful advice, but as a personal attack on his competence as a ruler. William had watched other advisors make this mistake, offering honest counsel only to find themselves stripped of influence and banished from court. The solution when it finally came to William, was as elegant as it was deceptive. Instead of opposing the king's plan, he would redirect it, making Edward believe that a superior strategy was actually his own idea while ensuring that William remained safely in the background, ready to take credit for success or deflect blame for failure as circumstances required. 3 days before the planned departure for Berwick, William arranged for a hunting expedition in the forests surrounding Windsor. He had learned that Edward did some of his best thinking while engaged in physical activity, and the informal setting would make the king more receptive to new ideas, especially if those ideas seemed to emerge from his own brilliant mind rather than from outside suggestion. As they tracked a magnificent stag through the dense woodland, William began his carefully orchestrated campaign. "Your Majesty," he said, matching the king's pace as they followed the trail, "I've been thinking about your strategy for Berwick. It's truly brilliant how you've recognized that Robert expects us to take the obvious approach." Edward slowed his horse, interested despite himself. "What do you mean?" "Well," William continued, allowing a note of admiration to enter his voice, "any ordinary commander would see Berwick as a trap and try to avoid it entirely. But you've understood something much more sophisticated. Robert has positioned himself there because he thinks we'll be too frightened to engage. He's counting on English caution." The king's expression shifted subtly, and William recognized the look of a man beginning to see himself as more clever than he had previously imagined. "Go on," Edward said. "The genius of your plan," William continued, "is that you're not actually going to give him the direct confrontation he's prepared for. You're going to make him think that's what you're doing, while actually accomplishing something completely different." Edward reined in his horse completely now, his attention fully captured. "Explain." William pulled out a small piece of parchment on which he had sketched a rough map. "Suppose, instead of marching directly to Berwick with our entire force, we were to divide our army. We send a visible force along the main road, enough to convince Robert that we're taking his bait, while secretly moving our main strength through the old Roman roads to the east. We could take Carlisle while he's waiting for us at Berwick." The king studied the rough sketch, and William could practically see the wheels turning in his mind. Carlisle was actually a far more valuable target than Berwick. It controlled the western approaches to Scotland and housed significant Scottish supply depots. Its capture would cripple Robert's entire campaign more effectively than any direct confrontation ever could. But the timing would have to be perfect, William added carefully. The feint toward Berwick would need to be convincing enough to hold Robert's attention for at least 3 days, while our main force moved into position. It would require exactly the kind of bold thinking that most commanders lack. Edward was quiet for several minutes, staring at the map and occasionally nodding to himself. When he finally looked up, his eyes were bright with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had just solved an impossibly complex puzzle. "William," he said slowly, "I think you may have helped me see the full potential of what I was planning. Yes, this could work, but we would need to be even more subtle about it." Over the following days, William watched with fascination as King Edward began to refine and expand upon the strategy, genuinely convinced that the core insights were his own. The king called additional war councils, drew up detailed plans, and even made several genuine improvements to William's original concept. By the time the plan was finalized, Edward truly believed that the entire strategy had emerged from his own strategic brilliance, with William serving merely as a helpful assistant who had aided in working out the details. The execution was flawless. Lord Geoffrey de Clare led 2,000 men along the main road toward Berwick, with instructions to advance slowly and make their presence as obvious as possible. Meanwhile, Edward himself led the main force of 4,000 through the ancient Roman roads, moving at night and avoiding all major settlements. William rode at the king's side, offering tactical suggestions that Edward invariably improved upon and claimed as his own refinements. When they reached the hills overlooking Carlisle, they could see that the town was lightly defended. Robert had indeed concentrated his forces at Berwick, exactly as William had predicted. The assault took less than 6 hours, and by sunset, the English flag flew over the castle walls while Scottish supply wagons burned in the courtyard below. The victory was complete and devastating. With Carlisle captured and its supplies destroyed, Robert the Bold's army found itself cut off from reinforcement and resupply. Within a week, the Scottish forces had begun to retreat northward, abandoning their planned offensive entirely. The rebellion that had threatened to destabilize the entire northern frontier had been crushed not through superior force, but through superior strategy. When the royal party returned to Windsor Castle 3 weeks later, they were greeted by cheering crowds and a celebration that lasted for days. King Edward was hailed as a military genius who had outmaneuvered one of Scotland's most cunning generals through pure strategic brilliance. Minstrels composed songs about his clever deception. Nobles competed to praise his tactical innovations, and foreign ambassadors sent respectful messages, acknowledging his reputation as a formidable opponent. Throughout the celebrations, William remained quietly in the background, accepting modest congratulations for his role as the king's trusted advisor, while ensuring that all credit for the strategy went to Edward himself. When courtiers asked about his contributions to the victory, William would smile humbly and redirect their attention to the king's brilliant leadership. But those who understood the subtle dynamics of court politics recognized what had really happened. William had not only solved an impossible military problem, but had done so in a way that strengthened rather than threatened the king's authority. He had demonstrated loyalty while exercising influence, shown wisdom while avoiding the appearance of superiority, and achieved his objectives while allowing someone else to receive all the visible rewards. More importantly, William had established a pattern that would serve him well for the rest of his career. From that point forward, King Edward came to rely heavily on his young advisor's counsel, but always in a way that made the king feel like the true source of their shared successes. William's influence grew steadily, but it grew quietly, exercised through suggestion rather than command, through guidance rather than direction. Over the following years, this dynamic proved its worth again and again. When trade disputes arose with Flemish merchants, it was Edward who brilliantly negotiated a solution that expanded English wool exports. Though the negotiation strategy had been carefully crafted in private conversations with William, when rival nobles threatened to form dangerous alliances, it was Edward who skillfully divided and neutralized them. Using tactics that William had suggested during their regular hunting expeditions, the arrangement benefited both men enormously. Edward's reputation as a wise and capable ruler continued to grow, enhancing his authority and ensuring the stability of his reign. Meanwhile, William wielded increasing influence over policy and decision-making, but without the dangers that typically came with visible power. He made no enemies because he appeared to threaten no one. He faced no challenges to his authority because he was careful never to appear to possess any. But perhaps most importantly, William had discovered something that would remain valuable for centuries beyond the medieval world. In any hierarchy, the person who can make others feel successful and important while quietly achieving their own objectives possesses a form of power that is both more sustainable and more effective than traditional authority. The other nobles competed for titles, lands, and visible signs of royal favor, creating endless conflicts and jealousies that weakened their actual influence. William focused instead on becoming indispensable, the one person whose judgment the king trusted completely, because that judgment always seemed to confirm Edward's own wisdom. The true test of William's approach came during the crisis of 1356, when England faced the possibility of war with France over disputed territories in Gascony. The king's traditional advisors were divided into two camps: the Hawks, who advocated immediate military action, and the Doves, who urged diplomatic negotiation. Both sides lobbied intensively for Edward's support, creating a deadlock that threatened to paralyze the government. William recognized that this was precisely the kind of situation where his subtle influence could be most valuable. Rather than joining either faction, he used his private access to the king to gradually steer Edward toward a third option, one that would simultaneously demonstrate English strength and avoid the enormous costs of a full-scale war. Through a series of carefully timed conversations, William helped Edward discover that the real issue was not whether to fight or negotiate, but how to structure a negotiation that would make it clear that England was bargaining from a position of strength rather than weakness. This insight led to a strategy of limited military demonstration combined with diplomatic overture. Sarasa show just enough force to prove that England was prepared for war if necessary. Then offer France a face-saving compromise that would resolve the immediate dispute while establishing favorable precedents for future conflicts. The strategy worked perfectly. A series of naval raids along the French coast convinced the French court that England was serious about defending its interests, while simultaneous diplomatic communications made it clear that Edward was also open to reasonable negotiation. The resulting treaty gave England most of what it wanted, while allowing France to avoid the appearance of complete capitulation. Once again, Edward was celebrated as a masterful leader who had achieved his objectives through a perfect balance of strength and wisdom. Foreign courts praised his sophisticated understanding of international relations, while English nobles marveled at his ability to extract concessions from France without the devastating expense of a prolonged war. And once again, William remained carefully in the shadows, allowing others to receive credit while quietly consolidating his own influence. But by this time, he had become something more than just a royal advisor. He had become the unofficial architect of English policy, the mind behind the crown, whose ideas shaped the kingdom's direction even as another man's name appeared on all the documents. This arrangement might have continued indefinitely, but William understood something that many hidden influencers fail to grasp. Even the most perfect system eventually faces challenges that test its fundamental assumptions. His opportunity to demonstrate the ultimate sophistication of his approach came when a younger advisor named Thomas de Ashby began to compete for the king's attention. Thomas was intelligent, ambitious, and dangerously direct in his approach to court politics. Rather than working through subtle influence, he openly positioned himself as an alternative source of counsel, offering advice that sometimes contradicted the king's instincts and presenting himself as the voice of honest truth in a court full of flattery. For several months, Edward seemed genuinely intrigued by this different approach, and William recognized that his own position might be under threat. The resolution of this challenge demonstrated the true genius of William's long-term strategy. Rather than engaging in direct competition with Thomas, which would have forced Edward to choose between his advisors and potentially weakened William's position regardless of the outcome, William simply allowed his rival's approach to reveal its own limitations. When Thomas offered advice that contradicted the king's judgment, Edward initially appreciated the honesty, but gradually began to feel that his competence was being questioned. When Thomas took credit for successful policies, the king began to wonder whether his advisor was becoming too ambitious. When Thomas pushed too hard for his preferred solutions, Edward started to perceive him as manipulative rather than helpful. William, meanwhile, continued his pattern of making the king feel wise, capable, and in control. He never contradicted Edward's instincts directly, never claimed credit for successes, and never appeared to have an agenda beyond serving his monarch's interests. When Thomas finally overreached, publicly correcting the king during a meeting with foreign ambassadors, Edward's patience snapped entirely. Thomas found himself stripped of his position and banished from court within a week. The contrast was not lost on the other courtiers, who began to understand that William's approach represented not just an effective tactic, but a sustainable strategy for long-term influence. By the time of Edward's death in 1377, William had served as the power behind the throne for 30 years, outlasting dozens of rivals and shaping English policy through one of the most successful reigns in the kingdom's history. But perhaps most remarkably, William had achieved this influence while maintaining the genuine affection and respect of the man he served. Edward never felt manipulated or controlled because William had mastered the art of leading from behind, of achieving his objectives by helping others achieve theirs, of exercising power by appearing to surrender it. In our modern world of corporate hierarchies and political campaigns, of celebrity culture and social media influence, this medieval wisdom has never been more relevant. The most successful advisors, consultants, and behind-the-scenes influencers are still those who understand that true power often comes not from being recognized, but from making others feel recognized, not from taking credit, but from ensuring that credit flows to those whose continued success serves your own interests. The lesson is not to become invisible or powerless, but to recognize that in many situations, the most effective form of influence is the kind that doesn't look like influence at all. Let others wear the crown while you shape the kingdom. Let others give the speeches while you write the words. Let others receive the applause while you design the performance. For in the stone corridors of Windsor Castle, William de Montfort learned that the greatest strategists are not those who win battles, but those who make others believe they won them themselves. And in that insight lies a timeless secret of leadership. True power is not about commanding others, but about making them want to do what you need them to do, and feel brilliant for thinking of it themselves.